Recording and we're live. And two people just jumped in the group. Hello, Tim. Hello, Regenerative Spirit.
Oh man,
And hello, Ticon.
I was gonna call Tim today. This is perfect.
Here he is. All right, everybody, we are live on Facebook, and I'm really grateful that we're all here together. We've got Ticon joining us from the United States. He is in Arkansas right now. And wow. Ticon has a lot of really interesting experience. He'll tell you the story. He found what we had. I met Ticon actually back in 2016. NewMundo.org had a gathering at Finca Morpho that called a bunch of communitarians from Costa Rica together to see what they had a bunch of questions for us and wanted to know how they could best serve the impact center movement in Costa Rica. So I showed up with a number of others, and we stayed at Finca Morpho and dove into that kind of thing together. And in the course of it, I shared the documents that we had written at Finca Fruition, and Ticon took it to a whole nother dimension. And he's going to share some of that with us. What did you share in the chat here?
That's the 8 respects and responsibilities that we'll be discussing that we evolved into from what you shared with us.
Okay, I'll share that to the Facebook group as well. All right, buddy. Well, go ahead, get into it. What's this document all about? What do you got to say?
Well, thanks for having me here today, and thanks for everybody watching this, and excited to form community, be part of community, support communities. I really believe that the community mission is at the foundation of the transformation that we're undergoing in the planet right now, and I'm super stoked to be a part of it. My story began in 2012 when I moved to Costa Rica, and it took me a few years of grinding the grindstone of just being in nature to start to tap into permaculture, which ultimately led to community, because when you're living off the land, it's a lot easier when you have hands. And like Jason said, in about 2016, we had New Mundo come, and that was pretty much right when we had started community. We actually found permaculture first, and we used permaculture, the principles of permaculture: observe and interact, gather and store energy. We use those principles in the formation of our community because we didn't have any experience both in permaculture or in community. And we also use it in our own kind of conscious or spiritual evolution. And as we were trying things on and just gathering and storing energy by allowing the experience to happen, then we had New Mundo come, and we found this first living agreement that we use, which, if I remember correctly, I wish I had it with me right now, but I think it was something like 70 agreements. And we started using it, and it's like, we of course took it and we deleted the ones that didn't match, and we added some other ones, and we started using it. And I liked it. It definitely covered what you want to happen in the community. Like, it's very important to set the intentions. But ultimately what happened to us was that it became like the book of law. And when there were people who weren't in accordance to it, it really struck a chord, because it was really set in stone that this was the way it was supposed to be, which was great. It wasn't a bad thing. But what was happening was, when we had new people come and we were trying to get them in alignment, we started to realize these 70 or 80 things, which I really think it was that many that we ended on the list with, was a list of 70 things that people needed to remember, and then they needed to change or alter the behavior if they weren't in accordance to it, and like be able to do all of them. And so we quickly found that that was like an adaptation process. Like, it took somebody quite a while to remember the 80 agreements that they needed to follow, because some of them were very specific. They had to do with, like, children, like, exactly, you need to do this with the kids, exactly, you need to do this with the animals, this animal, you need to make sure you do this too. And what began to happen was we continued to add to it, right? We'd go to a meeting and we'd be like, okay, well, this didn't work. Get out the living agreements and add another thing, which was great. But ultimately, that bottleneck of the training began like this separation where people who knew the living agreements and lived by them, they really liked them, but new people, they weren't up to that par, and it took them a while to learn all of these guidelines that they needed to then live within the structure. So we started to like really feel into it and to think, what, how do we really mitigate the communication, the training, the details? What are we actually trying to accomplish? And about that time, we also started reading several books on community, the co-creators agreements, and some other ones that you'll see that we quoted in the bottom of the 8 respects and responsibilities.
Ticon, just to let you know, I gave you share ability. So if at any point you'd like to share that on your screen as you're describing it, you're welcome to.
Oh, awesome. Thank you so much. I did not know that I had that. Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and share the screen, and I will share this one right here. Awesome. So ultimately, what we came down to was that the process that we were going through wasn't stopping, that we were continuing to add things to this living agreement based on any situation that wasn't what we wanted. And ultimately, every time we added something, it was a process to then tell the existing members, get them trained, have them be in alignment. And maybe some of them actually were like, no, I actually don't agree with this. And so then it started more and more conversations. So as we moved forward, we were like, well, what are we trying to accomplish? And we were like, well, really, we're just trying to create conscious, respectful people who are responsible, that actually do what they say they're going to do. And when it comes to like awareness or respect, that we can make lists forever, but really these are things that are and can be understood to be as like a way of being. And we found this document, and originally it only had 7, and we added the 8th. So the first one here, physical respect. This one's like super straightforward, right? And of course, like when we had some rules, we had actually quite a bit of, not rules, but guidelines about how you can touch each other, right? Because it's important. You have people of different ages and sexes, and that boundary of physical touch, began to have like, well, you can do this, but you can't do this, and you have to do that. It's like, whoa, wait a second. What do we actually want? Super simple. We want people to respect each other's personal boundaries. And that has to do with awareness. And you're not going to know anybody's in particular boundaries unless you actually talk to them and just ask them and understand what their boundaries are. And of course, refraining from violence and inappropriate touching, that's like an automatic. But we also did have several detailed things in our original agreements that made it complicated. So we just made it simple. I agree to respect personal boundaries, touch others appropriately. Sorry, my screen's a little off. And touch others with consent and appropriately, and refrain from violence. And so now we casted wide nets. And so that way, anything that was outside somebody's personal boundaries or didn't have consent is now automatically covered. So what that did is, rather than be proactive, we were responsive. So if somebody felt like their boundaries were crossed or whatever, automatically it got attention by what we call our relationship management team, which is something extremely beneficial for your community. Kind of off subject there, but emotional management, mediation, communication, counseling in a community, having somebody with that skill set and role to be the communicator is super important. And in nomadic community, that's how we would do it. So if somebody had a problem, they would speak to the relationship manager, and they would be able to hold the space with whoever violated this respect and address it. And what that did is it started to have a direct solution to every interaction. rather than a creation to a more complex system. So people didn't have to find the thing on the list to be like, oh, they broke this rule. They just had the power to say, actually, I don't feel comfortable with this. And that ultimately gave the people in the farm more confidence to have less guidelines. Right. And so they were like, okay, I don't actually have to put this on there because I know that I'm going to be respected, because our agreement that is, if I'm not respected, it's a deal. And that's what we agreed, is for us to respect each other. So we really felt like that simplified it, because as we added more people, they wanted to add more things, and then it became more complicated. And
Yeah, that
so,
makes sense.
yeah, you can see we've reduced the 70, 80 growing into 100 things into a single page. Emotional respect. I agree to respect other people's feelings and emotion and take responsibility and ownership of my own. This is probably, I would say, one of the most nuanced and powerful agreements, because what it says in it is you're respecting another person's feelings and emotions, and ultimately that would, in our community, mean that if somebody was upset or triggered, that we wouldn't then create stories, project, tell them that their feelings meant something about them. We allow them to go through their emotional process without attaching to them some burden for them experiencing their own emotions. And then the second part, taking responsibility and ownership of my own emotions, is the most powerful agreement, I would say, in the community. And what it means is, when I'm feeling an emotion, and I even have this thought or this story that this emotion is somebody else's fault, that actually I'm stepping back and regaining my own ownership, that my emotions and my feelings are the result of my world. And this is probably, for some people, this is the hardest one for the general public to integrate, because in our culture, it is a very common thought that when we feel emotions and when we start to think these stories, that those stories are our emotions. But as we were in community, emotions are single words: sadness, anger. We actually have a sheet that we use with the nomadic community from the NVC, nonviolent communication, that has, it's the feeling sheet. So when you go to find your feeling, you find it on the sheet. And if it's not a single word and you're telling a story, it's actually an explanation that you've created to explain to yourself why you feel that way. And most people have, not most people, a lot of people have never had that realization that their emotions are actually this energy, and their brain is making the story to try to explain the emotion. So once people can own their emotions and don't go into stories, they can say, I'm feeling sadness because I value these things, and it brings it back to this, their ownership of their own emotions. And so say somebody got really upset in the community, and they're going off, and somebody left a mess in the kitchen, which the kitchen, I know, Jason, you know, is a popular spot for disharmony. they blow up in the kitchen, and they get really angry, and they're feeling, some people feel empowered in their anger because, you know, it was an agreement, you weren't supposed to use a plate, which is true. But at the same time, we're also agreeing to take ownership of our own emotions. So we would find often that it would be reflective, and that people would also have to, you know, take ownership. Hey, actually, I'm sorry I yelled at you. I'm sorry I said those mean things to you. And I still want you to take responsibility for the spatial respect, which is coming up next, right? And that, I think, out of all of the agreements, is the most powerful agreement and understanding that anyone can bring into a community, for sure. Any questions so far?
No, I think that's just like, so far with what you're doing there, like I think all of this really points to taking personal responsibility for our place in the community. I think that's really super important. It's something I touched on at various points of my presentations over the last few days, and helping to retrain people's consciousness from the upbringing that many of us had of, like you said, being trained, like not necessarily trained, but encultured to make the story about how someone else made us feel or some circumstance made us feel be our truth. And we can get super indignant about it. And so this is really great to help untrain that out of people. Mhm.
Awesome. Yeah, and so just coming down this list, they're all short, so I'm just going to go ahead and read them all because it feels good. Verbal respect. I agree to be honest. Use respectful forms of communication with others and listen to what others are saying to me. This one is super key as well. And the last part of it, listen, is something that needs discernment, because listening doesn't just mean sitting there and like listening to them. It actually means striving to understand what they're saying. So regardless of what the word choice they used, listening means, what is this person actually trying to tell me? And that alone too is an extremely powerful tool in the community, because if everybody's actually listening from a place of deep listening or authentic listening, then you actually won't have any problems with verbal respect, because it is automatically taken care of because you're seeing their message. And so in this verbal respect, and a lot of these, they're double-sided, because they're double-sided for both participants in the agreement, because even if one person was a little bit, aggressive or a little bit subtly triggered, and their form of communication was a little sharp and aggressive, if the other person was actually in a space of listening, they would actually be able to hear that person and recreate them or tell them what they were actually trying to say. And that alone also diffuses the somewhat disharmonious form of communication. So we really try to empower both sides of a potential conflict, so that either one of them doing their role eliminates any kind of disharmony in the community. Yeah. Spatial respect. I agree to respect my own and others' rights to privacy, solitude, quiet, and security in their personal space, and to be conscious of my communal space. This one comes down to, we're living in community, which is awesome, but we each have our own energetic space that we need to feel grounded, especially as we go through long periods of time. And living in community, if you're popping over to your friend's house without invitation all the time, messing with their solitude and quiet, it drastically affects their impact to show up in the communal spaces in the community, because they need to care for themselves. And so this one became very important too, and it was easy to explain to people, rather than have like hours that you can go over there. And at first we created signs. We had like a green light, a yellow light, and a red light. And it was like, green means come over, yellow means I might be grumpy, and red means don't come. But then we just like really got it down to like, never assume, always use communication, always check, use your communication, use verbal respect, and know that everyone does value their privacy, their solitude, and their quiet, and their security to the utmost. And that is very important in the community. Awesome. Material respect, of course, don't take my stuff, right? I won't take your stuff. It's pretty simple, right? Respect for diversity. This one is actually one of the more nuanced ones, because it's not as easy for people to fully automatically do this. I agree to respect the diversity of people's age, genders, racial origins, sexual orientation, spiritual practices, and physical and mental capabilities. This one can be really interesting because, say you have, some vegans, right? And certain people have really strong emotional opinions. Some vegans think that there should be no meat on the farm, there should be no animal products, and energetically, it's very difficult for them to have respect for diversity. And it's a it's that's why these things aren't hard and fast and like this is a rule, you break, you're out. It's more like a target and a goal, and if it doesn't happen, then we're going to address it and bring awareness to the process that there is actually disrespect, there's disharmony, and there's people not honoring one another, and we're using these tools to bring awareness to those realities as a positive reinforcement to allowing people to be themselves and guiding them to a more holistic way of being. Have you had any strong opinions in the past, Jason, in your community?
I was usually the biggest jerk of them all, I'd have to say. No, yeah, there's all kinds. We we come from a very varied race, but yeah, of course, and like you're saying, yeah, some of these people that take their lifestyle choices and embody them like they were a religion are and it's understanding. We learn things like a shift in nutrition, or a shift in respect, or way that we see the world, or religion for that matter, literally. And all of a sudden we've had you know a blessing come over us in the way that we experience life and our relationship to it. And all of a sudden we're thumping the Bible and like, this is the way. and it's like, oh, okay, what if you told yourself that 3 years ago? Would you have received it the same way you're saying it now? So that's a good thing to think about when we discover a new way. Putting it out there as a way is often much more receivable than the way.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure. No disrespect, vegans. You're cool.
We'll have our season.
Yeah. Yeah, community respect. I agree to respect the community's ecosystem and consent-based decision-making process. So this one is kind of unique. We tended to our community's ecosystem because in nomadic community, we modeled the community model off of nature. We connected it to permaculture, and the ecosystem is our agreements within our community, which have to do with um, energy exchange, responsibilities, who gets to make decisions, who gets to stay, who has to go, all those things. And this just means, at this, the community respect, at that, it just is a reassurance that the people coming know that they're actually agreeing to how the community is run, right? And so ultimately, you could have these as your living agreements, and then in the agreement, you're just having them agree to how your model works. And then that way it's super simple. You're coming, this is how it works, you're agreeing to it. And that makes sure that as people come and join, you're not constantly changing this document and creating this like living training this union of people who are evolving. And consent-based decision making in our community, what that meant was we're really focused on decentralized governance. And in order to make that happen, we have the ability for any member of the proper rank to be able to make any decision that needs to be made so that the community can be responsive. And we use two forms of decision making. We called one is consent and one is called consensus. And the way that we define them was that consent means that there is no strong objection with a valid reason why it's too dangerous to try. Because we really strive to use sociocracy principles, safe enough for now, or safe enough to try and good enough for now. And so if you're in a community and something needs to be addressed and you're of the proper rank, that you can just poll the available people there, or even online in our Discord, and you could say, I'm going to do this, and I'm calling for a consent vote. And as long as nobody can give you an objection of why you shouldn't do it, then you move forward and you can do it. But if it's something that's going to affect the entire community, use materials, or a certain level, which we have a chart for, it goes into consensus-based decision making. And that means everyone actually has to say yes. And most people are like, wait a second, that's like kind of the same thing. But it's not really, because when somebody has to say yes, they put their name on the line, which actually means they need to feel comfortable with the actual plan, which means each person saying yes actually has to put energy into the thinking process to make sure that they actually support it enough to be like, yes, let's do it. We don't have too many consensus-based things. Mainly, they would be changing the entire ecosystem, which you can find in the upcoming guidebook to nomadic community, which should be coming out in about 3 or 4 months. And all these things that you hear me discussing will be in that book as well, the guidebook to nomadic community, including this document as well. And then we found the last one that we added, and we added what's called environmental respect. We felt like all of those were really good, but we were like, man, you know what's missing in here? Are we actually respecting nature? Do we actually respect the farm? Do we actually respect the animals? Because what we saw in our community is, especially nomadic, we really focus on transition. So a lot of people coming have never connected to nature, have no emotional connection or sense of stewardship, ownership, or responsibility at all. So their actions were drastically not in alignment to respecting nature. Being very, I won't say any of the behaviors, but things that were like, we're sitting there like, ugh, that feels real raw, hurting the trees and using chemicals and things like that. So we really felt like it was super strong to make sure that everyone coming at least agrees to respect the environment. And then what we did is we reinforced this agreement with feedback. So once they agreed to it and then we saw something, we would use the relationship management, not to scold them. And this is also a key, and I'm throwing in a lot of the aspects of nomadic community, but ultimately in your community, the person who is enforcing the guidelines or even guiding the guidelines, if they're triggered in any way, emotionally connected to the environment or the situation, they're unsuited to be the person to tell this person. Because ultimately we want to bring awareness to these people. And if it happens through the same way that they were domesticated or trained or programmed by their family or parents or society, it's going to be met with a big wall, a big shield. And we're not actually going to create more people who care about Earth. And so what we do is we just come to them with somebody who's really not affected by the situation. They have no bias. They don't care. But they can hold the space of love to be like, look, like, I want to bring something to your awareness that you agreed to respect the environment while you're here. And we saw you dumping gasoline all over the ground. And what do you think that does to the environment? And instead of assuming anything, really just have a conversation with them and let them know, at the end of the conversation, this is not respecting nature, dumping gasoline on the ground by, wherever. So if you want to stay here, we're going to request that you bring more awareness to your ability to respect nature and ask yourself how you're going to do that. And so now that creates a feedback pattern where we're bringing these respects into people's lives solely through bringing awareness to their actions and to their behaviors. Awesome.
Super awesome, brother. I can really tell, I can feel the refinement in your description, how, and I can feel through your stories how much work and how much time and heart and listening has gone into the refinement and your understanding of why it was worth refining things down to the way that you've got them now. Really appreciate you sharing your stories. I want to check in. You might have said it in the beginning. You probably did, and I just missed it. But you said you added an eighth, respect. Where did the original 7 come from?
Don't quote me for sure, but I'm pretty sure it's in the bottom right here. Yeah, right here. We use the book Creating a Life Together, Practical Tools to Grow the Eco-Village of Intentional Communities. It's a really popular book, and inside the book, it talks about community alternative societies had came up with this 7 respects.
Okay, community alternative societies. Yeah, I've quoted Dying Leaf Christian several times during the week. Yeah.
And so once we found that, we were like, wow, this is totally it. And we started using it, and we really felt like the only one that wasn't in there was the respect for the environment, the actual container in which was holding us.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And so yeah, the same ones are found for the responsibilities, and we'll just go through them briefly. I agreed to be accountable and punctual in my attendance at the community meetings and agreed upon meetups and workshops. And when I'm unable to follow through with my commitment, I will communicate it with anyone involved. This one is critical. This one is so important. Having people be holding their words and showing up when they say is critical to make sure that the community can function.
Absolutely.
And that's just it. You had to have people that keep their word when they're going to show up. And in our community, what we made our agreement was, if for whatever reason you were not going to be there, that for sure you had to communicate beforehand, and you never just no communicate.
Yeah, it was something that Ed touched on yesterday, Ed Zittelman, in his share, as he was talking about the agreements of his online community that he's part of. And I asked him, like, is there anything about the agreements that you signed with that community that's really changed who you are, how you show up in the world? And he said exactly that. He had a time where he was, they gave him a hard time about not showing up. And he's like, look, something to the degree about, his time is valuable, or he didn't have time for it, or something like that. And they were like, oh, excuse me, is your time more valuable than mine? And that just woke him up. And it was such a great learning lesson opportunity that he really took to heart. And this is saying that same thing, like, everybody who showed up and all of their time is so valuable. It's hard to make those commitments. And it's one thing to hold this in an in-person community where you're all living together, but the online community phenomenon, that's a whole nother thing. When people sign up for an online program and then they don't show up, it's like, well, you really want to call yourself part of the community? Right?
Yeah, and it's huge what you just said too, because we have this saying, what's the most valuable resource? Some people say money, but it's like, wait a second, your time can never be replaced.
Yeah.
Right? You have a certain amount of hours on this planet. You can't buy more of them. Maybe you can with some like heart transplants and stuff, but it's not very likely. So you got your time, and if you're taking somebody's most valuable resource in their entire existence and you're wasting it, that's like a huge disrespect, right? Like, you're not valuing them as a being, and that's something that's super critical. And I think when we get to the end, I'm actually going to go into, we'll see if we have enough time, but kind of the way to keep this in balance is actually having what we're calling like a not a recreation, sorry, to be able to take responsibility for not showing up. So it's not just you're responsible for it, but what does it mean to actually take responsibility? And when you're in a group doing anything, if Jason's in my group and he doesn't show up 3 times in a row, or even twice, doesn't communicate, I'm going to lose the trust, right? Like even mentally I can do whatever, but energetically I'm like, I don't know if I can trust this person. And in a group that you're trying to work together, if you're losing trust with each other, then your group's not going to work because you don't have that foundational energy. So for this number one, really what we ask people is to repromise. So like if you weren't, on time, like how are you going to make sure that you're going to be on time next time, right? Like what are you going to do to actually do something to eliminate this potential reality? That way the responsibility is actually taking action, not just like this old format of responsibility where it's like, I'm going to scold you and tell you how it's your problem, and that's you taking responsibility. It's like, no, that's just you scolding them. They're not taking responsibility anything. They're taking the energy of your upset, and that you're calling that responsibility, but really responsibility means to not make it happen anymore. So how you tell me how you're not going to make it happen? I think that's really, really super, super key. Oh man, somebody calling me. I have to keep turning it off. All right, let's float on. And the next ones they kind of circle back to the last one. I agreed to take responsibility for communicating and owning my ideas and feelings, and I agree to create my own feelings and emotions. This one is interesting because it can read kind of weird. I agree that I create my own feelings or emotions comes back to the original one, but what it can also be linked to is it can be linked to when somebody's upset, that they'll start to share that emotional story in a way where they're sharing the emotions. They're sharing this like emotional story, and then like all like a group of people all have the same emotion and feeling, and they're connecting it to this situation, and then they all come to you in a group and they're like, this person is making us all feel like this thing. I was like, wait a second, did you read your second thing? I agree that I create my own feelings and emotions. And so really it brings them the opportunity to see how gossiping and sharing an emotional story can actually create these, I don't want to call them artificial, but these like mixed emotional stories that then become community dramas, right? And I'm sure you're very familiar with that aspect as well.
Yeah, the group mind
The
that
group
gets
mind.
cultivated
Yeah.
from someone spinning their tail again and again and again and again to justify their indignation or their hang up, their circular thought, their inability to retrain themselves back to the moment. It cultivates such quite the snowball effect sometimes.
Yeah, so in that one, often what I would use it for is I would tell people as they would tell me the story, and they would tell me the story about how this somebody did something to somebody else in the community. I'm like, wait, you're telling me a story somebody else told you about what they did, and you're really emotional about it. So like where in there is like your emotions? Like how is this affecting you? And that kind of brought awareness to the process where they could start to connect the reality that they create their own feelings and emotions. Yeah, and the rest of them are pretty simple, right? You want people to show up. You want people to contribute what they agreed. You want people to clean up after themselves, right? You don't want to have people come and clean up. And then this number 5 is actually kind of unique. It's something that we really wanted to create for transparency. Sometimes when you get in community, there can be a lot of I don't know what a lot of deal making, right? And a lot of people involved. And really, we wanted to make sure that everything was 100% like honest and fair. And the best way to make that happen was that all monetary contributions and payments, people exchanging money together, people making agreements, that those are all known by the whole community. So that if anybody's being shady or maybe even taking money through communal assets or whatever, none of that can happen because everybody agrees that their payments and their monetary exchanges are completely transparent.
And you found that to be a pertinent agreement amongst a nomadic community?
Yeah, for sure. Because essentially we had so many different membership types, you know, roots, trunks, nodes, branches, leaves, and to keep them all energetically aligned in order for the person who's at your farm who's paying $1,500, $2,000 a month to be there, and then see somebody else who he knows isn't paying anything, to understand how it balances out, then it's not just the monetary contribution to payments. We're also open that that person, this is all the energy they're exchanging. That way, on both sides and on all sides, every member can see it is actually balancing out, and that nobody's being swindled. Like, we're not swindling, you know, short-term people to make a hippie haven where hippies just hang out all the time, right? It's actually a space where people are learning to grow, to take care of themselves, and to achieve and accomplish sovereignty. And I think this is really important in any community, because if you take new members on and you're talking about co-creating and working together and exchanging energy, if there is secrecy, then that's how people take advantage, because people don't know. So then that's where you get people, that's where you open up the possibility for somebody coming in and taking advantage of you, because you don't know what's happening in the background.
Right.
Yeah. I agree to take responsibility for myself, my well-being, and energy. And this one is super critical, not only, I would say, in nomadic, but in any community that somebody farms. If you're forming a community and you're agreeing to be responsible for each other, then you better really, 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 really know that person.
How responsible are they for themselves?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you're going to end up responsible for, you'll see, just go and do it and you'll find out. But you definitely don't. You want to make sure that people know that they're responsible for themselves and their well-being and their emotions, and ultimately coming to co-create with a full cup. And that's who you want to co-create with. And if they don't have that full cup, you know, you can send them over to me in the nomadic community. We'll fill that cup on up, and then they can come back and co-create with you.
Right. So this comes in, it feels like, you know, there's a certain vagueness or object, relativity in what it means to take responsibility for one's self, their well-being and their energy. So that's where, you know, some agreements will flesh that out more and be like, all right, this is what it means and blah, blah, blah. And I can see that's where you guys were going, and it got out of hand where people are like, well, that, if to me, taking care of one's well-being and energy means this, and somebody else says, well, we got to throw this in there. So how does this, something like this, end up being mediated if somebody's being, say, pointed out as not doing so?
So you're very right. The living agreements were more connected to behavior, and we used the guidebook to talk about how the system is run, and we separated the two. And so in our nomadic community, responsibility for yourself is very well documented in the guidebook what that means. So there's no grayness. They know what it means by going through the guidebook and learning the ecosystem. And yes, when you're making a community and you're making, I would separate them. The living agreements is very much about behavior. It respects how our culture is communicating and behaving with each other, but to separate it from how the organization functions, because you need a functioning plan that doesn't have anything to do with people, how people feel, right? You need a plan that actually is going to take care of your community and is going to produce the proper amount of abundance for you to have a community. And that in our model, we definitely have people taking responsibility for themselves in the way that means that all of it gets a little bit in depth, because in the nomadic community, we're having people commit to 7 years and go through this transformational college pattern cycle. And ultimately, in our community, responsibility for yourself means that you're not counting on the community to be your in location, to be what provides your abundance, to be what provides your security or your lifestyle. It's actually a space for you to utilize, for you to be responsible to create your own plan, your own new community. Maybe you meet 4 people at nomadic community that you actually make a long-term homestead with, right? Who knows what your next step is, but the responsibility in nomadic community is for you to figure it out and to not to plan to anchor in. But in the case of us saying I just have 3 friends, then there definitely can be agreements that we are agreeing to take responsibility for each other to go through this go through this journey. And in that, and there's another document I'll share here in a moment, what I feel is really important is clear exit clauses. So when you're going to make this agreement and you're saying, okay, the 4 of us are actually going to be responsible for each other. This is what I'm going to do. This is what you're going to do. We're forming a team together. We're going to make this event center or whatever it might be. And this is going to be our community. We're going to live together. This is our business. Awesome. We have a great plan. We have agreements. In that, super clear exit clauses from day one, so that the responsibility doesn't become immersed and enmeshed, where there's no way to get out of the agreement and no way to take out what you've invested or to leave it without loss. And so, if you, in this example with the 4 friends, you could say at 3 months, or what I've been doing for these types of co-creations is logging hours. And so it says, at the end, we're going to take the hour count and we're going to do percentages based on that. So if you drop out early, then you're just going to get whatever hours you put in. And I don't need to do any more to figure out how to split this energy up. And so going into creating a land project, if I'm making a land project with Jason and Tim here, and the 3 of us are going in together, if I have to bank on the 2 of them to be 100 and not to change, and I don't have an exit clause, that means now I'm all in. That means it's way easier for me to get out of harmony with these respects and responsibilities, because I'm attached and I have little flexibility to move around. So now I'm dependent. And this is just my story, but in the way that I see it, it makes people dependent on each other. And this dependency changes their emotional availability. And so I would say, hey, Jason, hey, Tim, we're creating this farm together. But if you back out at 3 months or 6 months, 12 months, 24 months, this is exactly what it's going to mean. So we can agree that we're responsible up until this point, and now we can responsibly not be responsible for each other. Is that making sense?
Yeah, for sure. I agree that those exit clauses and the different scenarios, that was actually the end of this morning's call was around, well, the topic we were discussing was what happens, what do you do with, what's the protocol for dealing with repeat offenders that of the agreements, people that are not keeping the agreements, that they're letting people down, that they're violating the agreements. And, so we talked about various things there. And then the conversation got into, okay, well, that's great for visitors. But what about, invested residential members? And we got into it a little deeper. Like that's, those are things that no member of the community, there's when you're writing a document, if you're going to have anything more fleshed out than what you're showing here, some people in the community might say, look, I don't want to talk about, I can't be part of that meeting. I'm going to go crazy if I sit and help you draft this document, but I'll read it and give my okay, right? I'll give my feedback on a comment on the document. But then I made a point that when it comes to the exit clause part, the consequences part, that should not be allowed. Everybody should be sitting at the circle deciding what those agreements are. And because that's where, when everything else breaks down, you say, well, I didn't agree to that. It's like, all right, but this part you agreed to. and you're being held accountable to something that you were present for the creation of. And that's really where, all the rubber hits the road, sometimes literally. And so how important it is to craft that carefully, thoughtfully over time and with everyone's participation.
Yeah. And so, like you're getting to a really good point, because essentially to make these living agreements with a group of people and to have enough understanding and clarity, you're talking about weeks, if not months of conversation.
Yeah.
And so you really, like, if you're going to make a community and you're making long-term agreements, I would really suggest, like, you're planning that thing out for 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, 3 years to actually get to the level of detail you need to have clarity, because each person's ability to retain information, to think about information, to consider information is different. And some people take a lot of time, or a lot of time compared to other people. And so it's really unrealistic to expect people in a single conversation to be able to absorb the information and have a relevant opinion based on their actual state of being. So you're making a living agreement, like a plan, a farm, and living agreements and a plan. You might as well plan to spend 6 months with these people and talk to them every day.
Yeah.
To really get the amount of communication needed to cover every detail, to have a conscious co-creation where you're actually considering each one of these points and everyone is fully aware and in harmony to the agreement.
Yeah.
So it brought up something here. In our community, we use what's called the 4-step process, or the 4-step agreement. And when somebody has a behavior that is or breaks one of these agreements in a way that is not going to work, like we cannot let it fly, we have first what's a written awareness letter. So first we write them a letter and we say, we want to bring this to your awareness that we noticed this behavior, this lack of responsibility, you broke a commitment, and maybe nobody's ever told you before, but this is happening. This is your first advisory note, and on any repeat levels, there's going to be not consequences, but there's going to be things that have to happen. And so, if it happens again after you give them this letter, and the reason that you do the letter is because if you just talk to somebody in person and it's like an emotional conversation, they're not going to retain all the information, especially if you're giving them expectations. So you give them a letter so that they can read over it several times and really get everything that you're requesting. And really, in the first letter, you're just bringing awareness. Hey, did you know you did this? Like, are you aware of this? Did you know you have support here? Did you know you get support here? And step number 2 is, hey, we noticed this behavior again, and now we're going to ask you to write a personal plan. We're going to, for how you're going to mediate this situation. What are you going to do to make sure that this isn't going to happen anymore? So we put the ball on them. We're like, here's an opportunity. You were aware of it. Now we know you were aware of it. Now it happened again. How are you going to make sure that this doesn't happen again? So we give them the opportunity, write a plan, give it to the council. I'm going to do this counseling. I'm going to set my alarm, whatever it might be. And then if it happens again, based on the severity and what it is, sometimes they'll get another, and sometimes that'll be the end. But assuming it's not too bad, or the council feels like it's okay, we then give them restrictions or requirements. And we say, now you have to do these things. You have to talk to the counselor. You have to get this training. You can't go in these spaces. You have these restrictions. This is now your limitations to being able to stay in our container. And then after that, or even on that stage, if it comes out of harmony, we're like, you know what? We loved having you here. It was awesome. It was cool getting to know you, but now it's time for you to take a vacation. There's a lot of other wonderful places for you to go. Check out this farm over here. Check out Deluz. Check out over here. We'd love to see you again in the future after you've had some time to integrate this experience and see if you've grown into a new level of awareness.
You hear that, Tim? I'm going to start sending all the degenerates your way.
Well, he's already taken several, and he knows how to pass them along, so it's okay. But it's actually been super effective policy because I've done this quite a bit, and people respond well because they actually have somebody, instead of coming down on them, they have somebody who's like, hey, look, like you got something that probably has been weighing you down for a while. It's probably affected you a lot, and it's affecting you right here. And we actually want to be supportive in it and help you to like eliminate this in your life. And but we want to be real with you too, right? This is what you're doing. And yeah, that comes down to this 8 one right here. I agree to promptly inform the relationship team member of violations of the R&Rs that I witnessed. And this is super key because if people aren't actually addressing disharmony, then it's not going to work. So we actually have it in the agreement that if you see something, you have to say something. You don't let it slide because it's not just one person's responsibility to monitor everybody's behavior. We're all agreeing to hold the standard, and we're all agreeing that if it's not to this standard, we're going to utilize what we have in our framework, which is the relationship manager, to make sure that our harmony stays intact in our community.
Yeah, that was definitely something that we pointed to as well today, taking that and planting the seed of initiative in people's minds. You know, so many people are brought up, or their personality type even is to not speak up, to not say something. And it's not healthy for community, honestly, for people to not be, to not take that role. You know, it is everyone's responsibility to be like, oh, I'm seeing something that really a lot of the people I'm living with would really prefer to know about it, but I'm going to stay quiet because I don't want to ruffle feathers or be the responsible one or something. It's like, well, that doesn't really actually feed the community necessarily.
No, it actually is bad. It's bad for the community. And it's really important that people say stuff because and I think it comes back to a lot of those people are afraid that it's going to cause problems. So when you create a culture of that these aren't problems, they're opportunities, it's really subtle because people are actually excited to talk about disharmony rather than like fearing it.
Yeah.
And so it's really important whoever approaches these subjects has the proper emotional awareness and training. And not necessarily training as long as they're really well experienced, but whoever addresses taking care of emotional harmony and balance in the community, their own inner emotional harmony and balance plays a huge impact on how it ripples out into the community.
Yeah. It's also unfair to the person who is willing to speak up and address the difficult situation. I'll just say it. In my personal experience, you know, my ex-wife she would come to me, be like, you should say something to so-and-so. I saw this and I don't like it. And I got trapped by that so many times. And it would just create this paradigm where she's like everybody's friend that loves to tell stories and everything's always all good. And then I'm the guy who says stuff. You know, and it's just like, oh, well, that's not fair. Actually, after a while, I'd be like, no, I ain't saying nothing. You go say it. Like, or let's bring it up together, but you're bringing it up in the circle. Or even sometimes she would say stuff to me and I would bring it up in the circle and then she would shy away, like kind of like, I don't know if I really have a problem with that. Like, that's not fair. That's not being community.
Yeah, and I think there's a key distinction I'm hearing in there too. It's if you're still forming agreements and you have people in the space, then each one of the agreements kind of comes back to what we started. Each one of the agreements are changing based on each new person who's coming and how they're behaving. And ultimately, it gets into people's individual relationships because some of those people you probably didn't have a problem with at all. You probably didn't see it and bother you, and you're like, what are you talking about? And so it's very critical that when anyone in the community has an issue with any one person, that they, rather than utilize the framework to try to like to get them into the system so that relationship managers taking care of them, that first they actually address the person because they're upset, right? So first the relationship manager has an NVC for them to talk about it, and their emotional like trigger doesn't go into changing the system or using the system to get or create harmony, they're emotional. So now they get support in their emotions, and somebody else actually evaluates the situation to say, is this actually out of harmony with our agreements? Or is this something that is just an emotional trigger that is being kind of linked together with our agreements? That's not actually what we agreed, right? So it gets kind of gray. And so that way, when we address feelings first, then we can just actually ask them, like, okay, like, are you still wanting to do something about it now that the person listened to you, and you're like actually feeling emotionally connected to the person?
It's a great
That makes sense,
process.
right?
Yeah, for sure.
It's 3:01. Do we want to open it for questions? Tim or Ian, you guys got any questions? Yeah. Oh, there's
I don't think I have a question, but I've really been enjoying what you've said. And there's a piece of me that really enjoys that somehow you guys have it down to like 16 bullet points, which is still, like, for my system, it feels like a lot, right? And in another way, it's like not a lot. So there, I kind of want to just like, it's like how there's the version of this where you enumerate everything, and it's like walls, right? And then like, oh, okay, hey, you bumped up against a wall. You know, there's a wall there. We don't do that here. And then there's almost like a femininity, like a femininity to what I've been seeing presented, which is you have to feel into and discover the meaning of these individually. So I'm thinking about what I want to do in my community, and I think it's a little closer to this. And when someone like joins or someone comes in, I think I want to design a process where they they choose like an existing community member, and then like for an hour, like just those two people talk. It doesn't really matter who, but it's like, what do these each mean to me? And just like, you know, kind of, so there's an internalization that happens, and like a personal meaning that would come from each of those. So there was no question there, but I really got inspired.
awesome.
I'll let you know, Ian. Don't let Ticon fool you. This is not the only document.
Okay.
I'm realizing as hearing him describe this, like, oh yeah, the training I just did this week, that I could have easily split that into 2 or 3 documents. And even mine, that document has a whole nother like 24-page subsequent document that is specific around the shareholders and more legal stuff. So
Oh yeah,
definitely this is a document with a distilled version for like to make an impact and in a memorable way. But it's certainly not the end of it. You can, when that agreements page I've shared with you on my website has at least 4 of the documents, this being one of them, that I acquired from their files that I'm sharing. I've also got their on-site reference guide, and the which links to a lot of documents, and then the red book, which is a welcome book and info about the structure of the farm, and the co-creators agreements. So
okay, then so what I'm realizing, the piece of agreements that inspires me are the directional, symbolic parts, right? Which I think is what I just saw, right? And I get that now, like in each of the domains, like, I mean, I've been valuing what we've been talking about in the workshop too. It's not really like that. That feels a little less me, if that makes sense. Like, I'm sure someone else.
Oh, after 5 days of teaching it, it feels like less me. I was like, wait a minute, what the hell am I talking so much about this stuff for? I'm over it. I get it.
Super appreciate it. Thank you.
Hey, Ian, can I ask a question for you?
Yeah.
When you're forming a community, what is the community doing? Like, what's its objective?
To experience ourselves as nature, and bring people into that. The ways that we want to do that are through inner listening, land listening, community listening, through community service. Am I hitting on the direction of your question?
But I just ask a question to learn more about you, Ian.
Yeah.
And ultimately, yeah, there's a backing to it. It's like, in order to have community is a word that we're in a community right now. We're on this call. This is a community, right? So you need to be, I would suggest, to be a little bit more accurate on what type of community you're trying to form and how it functions. Because this living agreement is how the people get along. And we focused, when I hear living agreements, that's the emotions, that's the people, that's the cultural guidelines. But ultimately, when we flash back to community, how is your actual community going to function in this world? Like, what are the actual logistics? Because the community members need to be the people who do the functions that make the community work, right? And that's where your agreements come to how we're actually exchanging energy and those things are working. But that's all straightforward, that if you keep that separate than how we're feeling and how we're like the emotional part, it's really straightforward. It's like, this is my work agreement, here. And while we're working together, we're going to treat each other with respect, right? But when you mix the two together and the community or your operation doesn't have a way for itself to function, then the emotional aspect will inherently turn into a competition for the available energy that you've provided into this space. Does that make sense?
Wow, I need that one again, actually. that was big.
So you're bringing these people into your community at your place when you're forming. If this community doesn't have a plan of action, how it's going to hold the space for these people to experience the reality you're trying to give them, and you're starting that container and inviting people into it without the plan of action, then you're inviting them to bring their feelings and all the things that we just talked about into the process of how you're going to provide the logistics for the community. So having a settled logistical plan before you invite people in or too many people in is critical, because this is where the community line gets off, because we're using it as a sense of just working together. And once it gets on a site together, it turns from community into commune, because we're communing together on the same land. And in order for that to work, the logistics of the structure have to be laid out. They can't be figured out by the people who show up, because it's only going to be emotions. Like, that's just what's going to happen. And you can ask somebody else on the call about this. It's just the nature of why we created this the way it is to bring awareness to emotions so that people could be conscious enough to formulate effective co-creations. Because what we're talking about, and what I'll share in this document in a second, is co-creation. Ultimately, I would imagine, Ian, you don't want to do this by yourself, right?
Well, I want to do, yeah, I mean, I want to be the caller, not actually the doer.
So there's a huge difference between a community member and a co-creator, right? If you invite a bunch of community members in and you really need co-creators, they're gonna overwhelm your life hugely. So if you're ready to make your community, you're needing co-creators to create the plan. What are we actually going to do to merge this financial reality to creating a container that helps people connect to nature and their true being? How are we where's the logistics? And if nobody's on your team and that's all up to you, you're putting a huge burden on your shoulders. And ultimately, you're just giving your energy to other people, which isn't bad, but it's to be conscious that that's what's happening, right?
is there a, and I guess this is a question for both, anyone on the call, is there a document or a piece of, like, because you're talking about an action plan, right? Which is,
Yeah.
I think about the word strategy and I think about the word roles.
Yeah.
When you're saying action, right? Like, I want to address that through like clearly defining all the roles necessary for this community to work well. And then it's a matter of like who, like fitting energetics together. How else should I be thinking about this other than like roles and like strategy within roles?
Well, that's perfect. The roles and strategies are great, but ultimately the roles and strategies to achieve what objective, right? You need to be super clear on what the objective is. And if there's no objective, then it doesn't matter how many roles and strategies you have, because you don't have a plan that's actually going to accomplish what's necessary to create the community. So in this reality, it's going to be quite determinant on your own current position. Like I couldn't tell you what to do without talking to you more, and I'd love to have some more conversations with you. But ultimately, it would have to do with, your community is going to need finances to start, and it's going to need finances to continue. What's your financial plan? That's the backbone of all of this. And if you don't have a strong financial plan with strong partners, then you're going in on a will and a hope that somehow you're going to gather enough energy to keep going. And that's where it gets really stressful, because people are investing, they're giving time, and there's no for sure track of how this is going to work. So it's literally like a lucky seven, we don't know what's going to happen, let's throw the dice. And so my first advice would be for you, in order to make this transition, to get this community set up, first, how are you going to get it set up? And then as it's setting up, what are you working towards to keep it going? How is it going to continue to pay for water, air, food, and shelter so that you guys can keep being there? Because if there's no plan, then every person who comes as a member, you're going to be dating them. Hey, I actually need a co-creator. Can you come help me make sure I got a plan for this community to keep going? And that is where things get super gray, right? So I'm going to send you a document called Conscious Co-Creation. And what this is about is and this is a huge one, if you're forming a group of people together and then you're trying to find a common goal, that's really tricky, because now you got a bunch of biodiverse people that are all on different pages. But if you set the goal and then you call in people who are already aligned to it, now you have alignment, right? And so the first thing is to find your co-creators and to have a vision, either you or them together. First, what is the vision? And the vision needs to feel freaking powerful, super powerful. It excites you from the core. You can see it, you can feel it. And then you talk with them, okay, how the four of us that were aligned through our heart centers, through feeling really powerful, how are we going to enact this? And then you have hopefully 3, 4, 5 other people. They're like, okay, here's the vision. I got these skills. And then you start to go into planning, actually creating, and you create an entire strategy, an entire detailed plan of how every detail of this plan is going to function. And in that, you'll have all the eyes to make sure, okay, that works. And this is why I say put 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, 3 years into this process, because when you have a unified team on the same vision and they're all working towards it, and you have it all completely planned out, where you've already observed, you've already planned, you're going to eliminate so much wasted time, wasted energy, wasted money. And when you finish, it's going to be on point, right? And so the third step is clear exit clauses. Because if you invest all this energy to do this with these co-creators, and one of them leaves or changes passion or changes direction, and now all of a sudden they're in your meeting like, I found, I don't want to say Jesus, but whatever, they found some new way, right? And they're like, let's take it this way, and they're really excited. If they're now bringing all that energy and trying to change the agreement you guys spent a year or 2 years on, that's going to be a huge detraction, right? it's going to feel really difficult because you've all invested so much. So having clear exit clauses and clear agreements that this co-creation is about the vision and not about the co-creators, and that every co-creator will get a fair energy return from what they contributed, but they don't have ownership of the vision. The vision owns itself, so that it will complete and it will see itself. And then the last agreement, this is super simple as well, is that the co-creators are agreeing it to do this for a regenerative purpose and not a profit motive. Not that they can't make profit or income, but that's not their motivation for why they're doing it. And I'm going to go ahead and share that out with you too right now. So yeah, lots of info, I know, but I love talking. So
Lots of, well, awesome. Lots I've thought about, but strung together and combined in a cohesive way that I think my mind struggles with. So like, I'm gonna probably listen to this again.
cool.
Yeah.
And when you get to the point of doing this, like, this is my passion, this is my dream, to facilitate, to support all people on this mission. So you want to have more calls with me, you just hit me up.
Heck yeah. Wow. Thank you.
All right, I feel like super awesome because I didn't think I'd have time for that, but I really like that because I feel that that's where people should start, is instead of getting into the community, which is really what, and this is my opinion again, the people want community because when you're connected and people who care, that's life. That's what we want. Like, who wants to live in a neighborhood nobody talks to each other and gives them hard stares? Like, humans are social creatures. We're most closely associated to the babobos, right? The monkeys that have sex all the time, right? And now we're in a society that's like, nah, don't hug me, don't touch me, don't look at me. It's like, inherently, that's what's driving people to community, is the human connection. And that is really sticky to mix together as the priority, but you can't prioritize that connection without a plan. Who's going to pay for that? Who's going to support it? Who's going to back it up? Yeah. So yeah, I definitely, I find I will be on more of these podcasts and events with Jason because this, like he was saying, that document is one of several hundred pages of open source documents that we're about to release. And nomadic community is copy left, which means that if you're going to use it for nonprofit, you can have it. If you're going to turn it into a business, there's some kind of fee, but it's open source information, and that's very critical for us. And conscious co-creation and noble counsel are all things that are going to be published about here really soon. But ultimately, when you're talking about co-creation, it's not a mind thing. When you really get into it, it's this like whole being experience. And the way that we've been doing that is with co-creative meditations and co-visioning meditations, where I'm actually on the wrong document, but I'm going to go ahead and put it in because guess what? It's super simple. So you always ground first. You're going to sit down with your co-creators. You're going to ground every time because you want the energy to be there in the container. You don't want people to be spacey, all spaced out. Then you're going to connect. Connecting is just checking in. This is where I'm at. This is what I've been up to. This is how I feel. This is where my being exists in this moment. Everybody gets around. We go around and connect. Takes a couple minutes apiece. And then clearing is this optional thing where if you're aware that you're still carrying an energy that's preoccupying your mind, your energy, you can verbally say, I'm choosing to clear the fact that I think this call should have ended 20 minutes ago, but I'm going to choose to stay focused, right? And it's actually a way to use your voice to completely get rid of the last bits of maybe distractions or inner energy that keep you from being in a space of co-creation. When you get into a space of co-creation, once everybody is cleared, it's yes and communication, right? Nobody's ever saying no. These are your co-creators. Everybody's there in a space for a reason. So we're taking everybody's niches and we're yes-anding a plan that everybody feels inherently can work. And at any moment, if there's feelings or people come out, we don't create anymore. We actually drop back and we make sure that the co-creators can stay connected to each other enough that they can actually create something together. And this has been something I've been implementing over the past couple months with the Nomadic Community Council, with Merlin at Mosen, and with Find Your Why, which is an activity that Merlin does. So when I go to meet with any of my co-creators, we always go through this format now. We stay focused on one conversation, which is just our creation. And what happens is streamline efficiency. It gets so efficient that your co-creators are like, in 2 hours, bust out what would have took you 20 hours by yourself. And it's just like bam, bam, bam. And then you just go. So from these little co-creation meetings, you set your objectives and then you go forward and you don't change the co-creation unless you go back to this format. So if you're in the daily life and there's some friction and somebody's like, oh, I don't know about this, that's actually just their emotions, because we created the plan already and we can address their emotions. That's cool. But if they want to come back to the creation, you actually have to go back to the circle. You need to ground back in, you need to connect again, you need to clear again. And these steps are the filter to make sure that individual co-creators don't bring their individual stories, traumas, or dramas into your co-creation. Yep. And that's conscious co-creation right there. Four clear agreements, 4 clear steps to how you make these you can do co-creation. If you really wanted to like start a new group and you felt like divinely connected to them, you could kind of use the same format to create a vision together. And the vision's different than the co-creation because once you know what you're doing, like I have a vision for creating a 4-temple medicine space with fire, air, earth, water, each one being a different type of plant medicine run by 4 goddesses, right? 4 females that are the stewards of each space. There's the vision. So anybody who wants to co-create that vision, we'll roll through this circle and we'll co-create that together. But if I got another group of people I'm working with and I feel like there's something there, maybe we'll drop into a co-visioning meditation to see if we can actually come up with a vision that we're all behind and we can become co-creators of. And I'll save Noble Council to the next brilliant time that Jason gives me, because Noble Council is also a super critical part of the level of emotional maturity, awareness, and availability you want your co-creators to be willing to do.
Right on, brother. You delivered. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for showing up. Definitely appreciate your presence, your wisdom, your experience, the documents you've shared. And yeah, I think a lot of people are definitely going to get some value out of this. So we did it.
Yeah. Nomadiccommunities.com on Instagram. And like I said, in the next few months, you'll be able to buy the first book in paperback or get the free copy of Why Nomadic Community, which explains this whole journey and what we've been doing, and the guidebook to Nomadic Community, which is how you make one of these spaces. And then later on next year, you can see some more books, the philosophies of Nomadic Community. But where this really is awesome is we're creating an online training and support network. So you can go onto our Discord. We have a Finca Morpho Nomadic Community Discord. You can get support, connection, and you can also become part of our community on the Discord. And I think that's one of the most powerful aspects of this is we're going to be doing training in Nomadic Community, but also in permaculture, in leadership, and emotional awareness. And you can receive all this training on Discord for now and coming up in our app, and we'll be connecting to other communities and holding listening circles, men and women circles, and a whole skew of activities on the Discord so that this community isn't a physical location. The community of Nomadic Community is digital, and we show up in physical locations in what's called seasons, which you'll read all about when you go to nomadiccommunity.com. Communities, nomadiccommunities.com.
Okay, I'll share that link with everybody. And
Thank
you also mentioned Instagram, so I'm guessing it's at Nomadic Communities. Or I'll
Don't
look it
quote
up.
me,
I'll
but
look it
yeah,
up.
I'm pretty sure it might have an underscore in there.
Okay, I'll look it up and share that as well, since you
Awesome.
mentioned it.
Thank you so much for having me today, and thank you for so much for being the steward of this mission. I said it at the beginning, but Jason here is the main inspiration that led to the creation of Nomadic Community, and his work at Finca Fruition, and literally exactly what he's doing. That's what we hit the ground with. He was super willing and kind to give us the information, and that's why we're really behind this open source concept, because we want everybody to be able to continue on this journey. So thank you, Jason.
Yeah, buddy, doing it together.
Yeah, bud. I'll
All
see
right.
you. I'll see you in a couple months if I don't see you before.
Sounds good. Travel well.
All right, much love, family. Everybody watching, check me out. Have a wonderful day.